And so our last session is going to be Michael Tourtellotte tackling the topic of Augustine's treatment of the city of man and the city of God. And most of you know who Michael is, but for those who don't, he was born and raised here in Salem and attended EBC for most of his life. He completed his undergrad studies through kind of a combo of Biola and Moody. And he is married to Amanda, and they have 2 daughters, and he serves as a pastor here at EBC. So welcome, Michael.
Good morning to you all. And Brett always forgets to thank himself when he runs through that thank you list. And so thank you, Brett, as well, for all the work that you put in just to organize this and to... Brett pretty much just comes up with everything and tells us what to talk about, and so, and then we do our best, and so he does a ton of work. I also know the Davison family does a ton of, well, I saw Maggie, I don't know where the rest of the Davison family is. Wherever you are, Davison family, I know you do a bunch of work to help your dad, and so thank you as well. And yeah, it's been good to be here with you all and learning with you all, and hopefully you've gleaned some helpful truths over the last evening and morning. And it's good to get to wrap things up with you by looking briefly at St. Augustine's City of God. So Brett gives everybody else a weird title. He gives me a 4,000-page book and tells me, it took Augustine 13 years to write it. It takes about 30 years to read it. And Brett told me to summarize it and apply it in 45 minutes. So 45 minutes isn't going to happen, but I should have you out of here in a couple of weeks. So yes, that's a joke, although we probably could spend a couple of weeks on it. I'll try to keep it as close to 45 minutes as possible. But it's going to be an extremely brief look at this masterful book. And masterful is probably an understatement. Part of the reason it takes so long to read, it doesn't actually take 30 years, but it does take a long time to read this book. And part of the reason is because Augustine is interacting with this vast range of topics and philosophers and authors. He's all over the place. Even if you just kind of skim down through like his section headings, which we'll look at a few of those. The full title of this work translates to something like The City of God Against the Pagans. And it is so titled because the book was written as a defense of Christianity, specifically against paganism, against the common pagan beliefs in Roman society in Augustine's time. So he responds sort of to the common beliefs, but also to the more philosophical pagan views as well. The first 10 books are actually an examination of Roman history. He kind of runs through all of Roman history, in which he responds specifically in varying extents to views held by Cicero, Seneca, Plato. The City of God is actually conceptually is probably somewhat tied to Plato's Republic, or sort of a response to that in some ways. So he responds to Plato, Plotinus, Varro, and many other writers and thinkers. And don't worry if you didn't know all those names, that's just fine. Nobody knows all the names that he brings up in here, just about nobody. In so doing, he interacts with a host of worldviews and philosophies, including paganism, of course, Platonism, Stoicism, Neoplatonism, and more. And so you realize as you dig into this book that you really need to read a whole library of other books to thoroughly and properly understand what Augustine is doing in his. So because of that, if you were to pick up The City of God today and start reading, the chances are you would find it fairly inaccessible, at least the first time through. In fact, some of the questions Augustine deals with are downright weird, at least to 21st century eyes. For instance, to name a few of his section titles, here you go. Of Varro's opinion that it is useful for men to feign themselves the offspring of the gods. So he has a section on Varro's opinion that it's helpful, it's useful for people to pretend they're demigods. Is that included in anybody else's defense of Christianity today? Is that high up on your apologetics list of things to cover? No? Me neither. Or how about, whether if the highest power belongs to Jove, Victoria also ought to be worshipped. Again, Apologetics 101, anybody? Or what Apuleius, the Platonist, thought concerning the manners and the actions of the demons. So, fairly inaccessible to 21st century eyes. We even struggle, even as Christians, we struggle to understand or to sort of get Augustine's biblical and theological arguments at times. Here are a couple of those section titles for reference. That we ought not to seek to comprehend the infinite ages before the world, nor the infinite realms of space. You guys get what he's talking about, but again, anybody defending Christianity by telling people, you shouldn't try and imagine the infinite time before the earth was created. Anybody? No? Or of the perfection of the number 6, which is the first of the numbers, which is composed of its aliquot parts. Does anybody know what aliquot means? Yeah, I didn't either. I think I can't remember what it is now, and so yeah. Obviously, in all of these examples, there are important portions of historical, philosophical, cultural, and theological context that the average 21st century American does not have. And so, some of Augustine's points are lost on us without digging into that context. But rest assured, if I haven't already convinced you of this, Augustine is a genius. Augustine is a genius, and each one of those strange-sounding sections has a purpose in his defense of Christianity. But in many ways, that defense is tethered to the context in which Augustine is writing. It's tethered to the context in which he's writing. It's an argument for his day and age, which all this might sort of beg the question of us, why would we even spend 45 minutes to talk about this book, much less take the 45 hours required to read it? Why would we do that? And the answer is that it does have something to offer us. It actually has a lot to offer us, I would say. But it has something to offer us. While we may need to discard certain portions due to the fact that they're dealing with issues that are either long since resolved or at least have diminished, like the whole paganism piece, that the whole book was written against, that part doesn't apply to us too much anymore. So we may need to discard some parts, but there are still many valuable insights to be gained from observing Augustine's project in general, what he was trying to do in this book. So too, I think there are valuable insights to be gained from observing how Augustine goes about his project that can help us in similar efforts in our context. So this is what I hope to do this morning with you. I want to provide enough of Augustine's context, and you've gotten some of it already this week, and a lot of it already, especially this morning. I want to provide that context for us so that we can see the major motivation and the major goal that Augustine had in writing the City of God. And then we'll briefly overview the book's argument, kind of look at the broad strokes of his argument. And then finally, we'll consider what there is for us to glean from Augustine's work that will help us live in, contribute to, defend, and call others into the City of God in our day and age. To do that, I'm going to need some help, so let me pray for us, and then we'll jump in. Father, we're thankful for the rich history that we have as Christians. We're thankful for that cloud of witnesses that has gone before us, that has laid so much of the foundation on which we now stand, even as we were just talking about your nature, Jesus, and how it is hopefully common to us and given to us that you are fully man and fully God, and yet that was a hard-fought battle in the 4th century. So we're thankful for those like Athanasius and like Augustine who fought that battle for us, that we may stand on their shoulders, and that we may stand on the shoulders of giants and be able to see even deeper into your goodness and into your mystery and into your truth. So we're thankful for this rich history. And so we just ask for your grace now, your help now as we look at this, this book. Would you just reveal yourself to us through this time? Would we come away loving you more and following you more faithfully? And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So the most prominent historical event that informs and provided the onus for the writing of the City of God was the sacking of Rome, the city of Rome, by the Visigoths in AD 410. The fall of Rome, the city, was considered by many not just to be the fall of a city, but the fall of the entire empire of Rome in the West. But the fall of the Western Roman Empire had really been at least a few decades in the making, and the new sort of Germanic regime that comes in, they would continue to consider themselves Roman and would continue to set up emperors, which were really just kind of puppet emperors, but emperors for a while to come after the fall of Rome, the city. But all that said, it was still a massive, world-altering event, since it was the fall of the city that had been the seat of Roman power for over 1,000 years. For over 1,000 years, Jerome, I think it was, he said he was sort of mourning. He was sort of mourning the fall of Rome, and he said, the city that conquered the world has itself been conquered. And so that was the significance of this event. And in the wake of this catastrophe, the Roman people were left to wonder, how and why did this happen? How did this happen? Why did this happen? And Christianity seemed like a good place to put the blame. It seemed reasonable to think that the pagan gods, that pantheon of gods, were angered by the Christians and how Christianity had been converting their followers and diverting their worship. And that the fall of Rome, was their retribution for the pagan sort of unfaithfulness. Additionally, the Visigoths were actually predominantly Christian. They were predominantly Christian, albeit an Arian form of it. So Brett earlier talked about the controversy, with Arius and Arianism that came out of that. But there was this whole branch of Christianity, or at least a whole branch that considered itself Christian, that was Arian, and that's where the Visigoths were. And so they considered themselves Christians. So the whole thing probably looked pretty bad to the Roman pagans, because an army of Christian barbarians comes and brutally destroys their city, massacres its population, with one notable exception: the Christians and their churches are spared from the destruction. So the pagan population might be excused from having a little bit of ill will towards Christianity after that all went down. And while this is, in one sense, an exceptional time in the history of Rome's relationship to Christianity, in another, it was really just keeping with the status quo, this sort of the pagan population disliking the Christian population. In one sense, it was exceptional after the fall of Rome, but in another, it was just the status quo of the first 3 or 4 centuries between the church and Rome, which we've already, again, looked at this weekend. But from the time of Christ until 313 AD, the Christian church was jerked between times of persecution and then times of relative acceptance, at least where they weren't being actively persecuted. In the first 300 years of Christianity, there were 10 or more official Roman persecutions, in addition to many other unofficial and more localized ones. And Pastor Eric spoke to this last night. So I'm just going to do a brief review of some of the major persecutions, just to give you a flavor of what the sort of ebb and flow of Christianity's relationship with the Roman Empire was for the first 3 centuries. So the first persecution was AD 64. When a fire broke out in Rome and destroyed much of the city, and the population blamed it on Nero. Okay, so this is the persecution under Emperor Nero. And the population didn't like Nero, and so they were blaming him. So he started looking for a scapegoat, or a scape group, maybe a more accurate term in this case. And the Christians is where he landed. He landed on the Christians because they were already a somewhat distrusted and disliked population within the city. And so that was the first persecution. Then a little over 30 years later, so 30 years of not being actively persecuted so much, then the Emperor Trajan, he began his persecution of the church, and that would last about 20 years. And this is where we would get that first sort of unofficial policy of what to do with Christians. The correspondence between Trajan and Pliny the Younger has already been mentioned a number of times. And it was in that correspondence, and I can't remember who it was that talked about, I think it was maybe Pastor Eric again, who talked about Trajan's policy, or sort of unofficial policy, was that you don't actively kind of hunt down Christians. You don't accept anonymous accusations of Christianity, but if somebody's brought forward with a legitimate accusation of Christianity, then you try to get them to worship the pagan gods to prove that they're not Christian, and if they don't, then you put them to death. And that was the unofficial policy for about 200 years. 200 years after this became standard procedure. Then after Trajan, though, Christianity enjoyed a relative respite for a little over 40 years until Emperor Marcus Aurelius came to power in AD 161. And this is where my favorite martyr comes in, which is Polycarp of Smyrna, which again, call him Dr. Eric. I don't know if he's a doctor or not, but Pastor Eric talked about Polycarp of Smyrna last night, and man, if you remember the account of his persecution, it's just incredible. It's just I love. That's my favorite story from early church history. And so he was martyred under Marcus Aurelius. And the early church historian Eusebius, he records that account of Polycarp's arrest and execution that Pastor Eric read. After the persecution under Marcus Aurelius, there were other notable persecutions under Severus, Decius, he mentioned that as well, which is the empire-wide persecution, Valerian, and then Diocletian over the next 125 years. So more persecutions, again, with sort of varying lengths of relative. Christians were never loved during this time, but at least they weren't actively persecuted between those as much. So it wasn't bringing this back to the fall of Rome and sort of the anti-Christian sentiments going around after that. It wasn't exactly a rarity for there to be tension between Christians and the Romans. But about 100 years before the fall of Rome, Christianity achieved that unprecedented acceptance that again, I think Brett talked about. When Constantine was converted to Christianity by way of his Milvian Bridge experience. And that led him and Licinius, the other emperor at the time, to give Christianity full legal status within the Roman Empire. And that was the Edict of Milan in 313 AD that Brett mentioned again. And so it's full legal status, not necessarily the official religion of Rome, but definitely accepted, and the emperor of Rome is a Christian, and so that's a big deal, obviously. And that acceptance deepened around 320 AD. I think Brett said it was 324 where kind of things wrapped up between Constantine and Licinius, and Constantine defeated Licinius and became the single emperor of the entire Roman Empire. And so then, of course, the acceptance of Christianity was just increased when that happened. With these developments, as we've been talking about this morning, came this whole new era for the church. This era of comfort. This era of comfort, like Pastor Brian just talked about. But with that came that whole set of challenges that Pastor Brian talked about as well. Of course, the newfound favored status for Christianity was a blessing in many ways, but there was a downside. Brett mentioned how historians have long argued about whether or not Constantine's conversion was truly genuine. On the one hand, at the time of his conversion, there was really nothing to be gained politically or militarily for Constantine by becoming a Christian, and yet he did, so that points to possible genuine belief at the time. But then it was a real mixed bag after he became a Christian. He made some morally abhorrent decisions after his conversion, even having his own wife and son unjustly executed. He also had ongoing ties to paganism, and even I think Brett also mentioned that towards the end of his life, he became a lot more sympathetic towards Arianism as well. So again, a mixed bag after the fact. But in some ways, Constantine he becomes emblematic of the church at the time too, this mixture of where Christian and Roman stuff is all mixed together. He becomes emblematic of that because the church moving forward had to answer this question: what should an amiable relationship between church and state look like? Or church and the Roman Empire look like? What should that look like when the church and the Roman Empire are on good terms? And this era opened the door to confusion between and a mingling of those two institutions, the church and the state. And Brian went into this a bit as well. Christianity became entwined in politics and society and vice versa. Pagan practices started to find their way into church practice. Who's getting excited for Christmas, by the way? Which might actually date back to this time period as a repurposed pagan celebration. It's not for sure, but Christmas might be from paganism. Sorry if that's disappointing to you guys. But Christian nationalism also kind of makes its first appearance on the world stage, with the state involving itself in the conflicts and the controversies of the church. Again, the Arian controversy, where Constantine plays a large role in that, and even to the point of enforcing certain beliefs and practices. So this is a new frontier, both for Rome and Christianity after Constantine's conversion. And then into this kind of new era. I mean, it's about 100 years, after the fact removed or so, but the church is still at least trying to figure things out. Rome's still trying to figure things out. And into that new era comes Alaric and the Arian Visigoths to sack Rome, throwing the still majority pagan Roman Empire into turmoil. So while Christianity was accepted, while Constantine Christianity was accepted within the Roman Empire, still the bulk of people were pagan. And into that turmoil steps Augustine of Hippo. Born in 354 AD in North Africa, modern-day Algeria. He was raised by a Christian mother and a pagan father. So again, notice this theme of people now who have this mix of Christian and pagan influence, right? Because this is essentially what Augustine's going to deal with in his book, and he's part of it. A Christian mother and a pagan father. He was Roman. He was educated in the Roman educational system. Converted to Christianity under the ministry of. He was sort of had kind of a wild youth. His mother prayed for him though, kind of throughout his childhood, and he was eventually converted to Christianity under the ministry of Saint Ambrose in Milan. And then he became the presbyter and then the bishop of the church at Hippo, which is also in North Africa, also modern-day Algeria. And that's where he gets his title, Augustine of Hippo, from. And then 3 years after the fall of Rome, this guy begins writing the City of God. Initially, it's a response to the specific charge that Christianity had caused the fall of Rome. But it turns into an all-out, more broad defense of Christianity against the long-standing pagan religions and philosophies. And yet, while that is his primary purpose, to defend Christianity against paganism, that doesn't nearly capture the vast scope of things that Augustine covers in this masterwork. The range of topics he covers, as I've already alluded to, is staggering. Not only is he defending Christianity in general and in specifics, but again, he's also responding to things like Plato's understanding and Cicero's understanding of what society should look like, all by fleshing out for the church this big question they had at the time, which is, what should the relationship between the church and the state looks like? So all this to say that throughout this book, he's operating on a bunch of different levels. The scope is incredible. So I'll just say again, understand that this massive work has made significant contributions to theological, philosophical, and political thought, and we're just going to examine the bare surface of it. Okay, so just understand, you're getting barely anything out of this this morning. That said, the city of God is comprised of 22 books. 22 books divided into two sections, broadly speaking, books 1 through 10, and then books 11 through 22. And those sections can be further divided into into 5 subsections, books 1 through 5 and 6 through 10, and then books 11 through 14, 15 through 18, and 19 through 22. The first 10 books, as I've already mentioned, they're devoted to arguing against the claim that Christianity caused the fall of Rome as a judgment by the Roman gods, the pagan gods of the empire. But again, Augustine's argument is larger than that. He's not just going to respond to that specific claim. He spends the first 5 books talking not only about the calamity of Rome's fall, the city of Rome, but addressing, as I said earlier, Rome's history more broadly. And he shows that the pagan gods have actually never reliably protected the Romans from calamity. Never. And therefore, they ought not command worship on the basis of providing blessing or protection in this life. They've never reliably provided that for Rome. Whereas Christianity provides a framework in which the blessings and difficulties of life are both used for the good of the believer. Whether it's the blessings just because they're blessings, or the difficulties because they purify us and they prepare us for the life to come. So that's what he does in the first 5 books. And then he deals with this life and whether we should worship the pagan gods or the God of the Christians for the sake of blessing and protection and good in this life. And then in books 6 through 10, he makes a similar argument, but in regards to eternal blessedness. Again, concluding that only the one true God can provide eternal blessedness, and the pagan gods cannot, which makes sense since he's already argued that they can't even reliably provide earthly, temporal, mortal blessedness, so why would we trust them for eternal blessedness? Having finished his comparison of the pagan gods to the Christian God, Augustine shifts in books 11 through 22 to examining the contrasting origins, progress, and destiny of the city of God and the city of man. And he starts really from the start of history, and he goes all the way to its culmination, using Scripture's storyline as his basis. In books 11 through 14, his focus is on the origin of the world and the origin of the two cities, these two cities, the city of God and the city of man. The city of God and the city of man, or sometimes he calls it the heavenly city and the earthly city. So he focuses on the origin of these things. And again, that description doesn't do this section justice. This is the last time I'm going to say this, but just know you're barely getting anything. Again, because that description doesn't nearly do that section justice, because his scope, again, is far more wide-ranging than the description of the origin of the world and the origin of the two opposing cities suggests. He addresses the infinite ages that preceded creation in eternity past, as I already mentioned earlier. He addresses the creation narrative of Genesis, the creation of the angels specifically, the presence of evil in God's good creation, the doctrine of the Trinity and its reflection in creation, the specific evil of death, and much, much more. But he locates his primary argument, he bases his primary argument about the origin of the two cities in the creation of the angels, which he sees as occurring during the 6 days of creation in the Genesis narrative, specifically when God creates light on day 1. That's when he sees the angels being created. That might sound odd to us, like a jump to us theologically in the 21st century. Again, like, oh, the angels were created when God said, "Let there be light." How did you get there? And if you read it, he actually has a pretty compelling argument for how he got there, but that we don't have time to go into. But it has its merits. That his view has its merits as you kind of look at the impact it has. For instance, we'll consider the question of evil, the presence of evil. And first, understand that Augustine saw more than just the angels being created when God said, "Let there be light." It wasn't just light being created. It wasn't just the angels being created. He really sees the whole dualistic paradigm of good and evil being set up when God creates light. For in creating light, God drew attention to darkness by contrast. So now you have light and dark. But if you notice, in the creation narrative, and you can go back and look at Genesis on your own time, but in the creation narrative, God does not create darkness. He doesn't create darkness. Rather, the darkness of non-existence, which is, again, how it's operating in Genesis 1, was what he brought the light out of. And by so doing, he drew attention to this non-existence, this darkness thing, and so he named it. He named the light day, and he named the darkness night, but he did not create it. So darkness then, which represents, again, like evil for Augustine, cannot be said to have a true existence, because it is the quality of non-existence, both in the Genesis narrative and in Augustine's thought. Hopefully you tracked that, and hopefully you can see the genius of this explanation of evil. God did not create it. He created goodness. He created life. He created light, which formed categories for the absence of those things. So he created goodness, light, and life, which created the categories of the absence of those things: evil, death, and darkness. Evil, death, and darkness. And so this explanation, it gets at the presence of evil, how there's evil in God's good creation, while also making it clear that it did not come from God. All right. So Augustine sees not just the angels being made in the act of God creating light, but two opposing societies being formed: the city of man, or the city of earth, and the city of God, or the city of heaven. Again, that representing this sort of dualistic paradigm of good and evil, the city of God and the city of man. And these two cities, he says, are defined also by two opposing loves. One is the love of self, and the other the love of God. The love of self defining the city of man, and the love of God defining the city of God. At the end of book 14, he says, "Two cities then have been created by two loves. That is, the earthly by the love of self, extending even to the contempt of God, and the heavenly city by love of God, extending to the contempt of self." So that's what he sees happening. From this diametric opposition, you might expect the city of God and the city of man to manifest or to present themselves as completely, thoroughly separate societies in the world, right? Oil and water, they do not mix. City of God over here, city of man over here. They're diametrically opposed. But Augustine actually spends the books 15 through 18 showing that this is not so. In these books, Augustine's main purpose is to show the mingling of the cities of God and city of man, that they're mixed together, and also God's sovereign preservation of his city from Adam to the time of Christ and the church. And so, beginning with Adam and Eve, Augustine shows how there were those who tried to preserve themselves through human effort, and then there were those who were preserved by the promise of God. Or as he calls them, there were the children of the flesh, and there were the children of the promise. And he traces these two lineages, basically. The children of the flesh included people like Cain, who tried to obtain blessedness by killing his brother, who the blessing had been given to by God. Or people like Ishmael, who was the product of Abraham and Sarah, trying to obtain blessedness apart from the plan of God, and so on. So those are the children of the flesh. And then in contrast, there were the children of the promise, who he traces the genealogical lines of Seth all the way to Noah, and then Shem after the flood, and then eventually to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to show the children of the promise being preserved by God throughout history. Now, because the Bible's narrative tends to focus on the children of the promise, that's what the story of the Bible, at least the Old Testament, is all about, Augustine spends book 18 paralleling pagan human history with the biblical history to show the progression of the children of the flesh that was happening parallel to this preservation of the children of the promise. And then he ends this section, he ends 18 in this section of his work saying this. Thus far, we have depicted the mortal course of the two cities, the heavenly and the earthly, which are mingled together from the beginning to the end. One of them, the earthly, has made for itself such false gods as it wished, from whatever source it chose, even creating them out of men in order to serve them with sacrifices. But the other, the heavenly, is itself made by the true God, and is itself to be his true sacrifice. Both cities alike make use of the good things or are afflicted with the evils of this temporal state, but they do so with a different faith, a different hope, a different love, until they are separated by the final judgment and each receives its own end, to which there is no end. So, Augustine concludes this section, summarizes it, saying that life is much the same for pagans and Christians. We all encounter good, we all encounter evil, but that it is the faith, hope, love, and destiny of each that really matters, that sets us apart, that sets the city of man apart from the city of God. The faith, hope, love, and destiny. Faith in the true God who can provide eternal blessedness versus faith in the pagan gods who are unreliable to bless. Hope that blessedness will be found after this life, and that this life is a preparation for that, versus the hope that we can find blessedness in this life. Love of the true God versus love of self, and the destiny of eternal blessedness versus the destiny of eternal misery. Those are the things that separate the city of God from the city of man. And it's the contrasting destinies of the two that he focuses on in the last section of his work. He begins this last section with a discussion of what he calls the supreme or the final good. The supreme or the final good. And he argues that all men seek this. All men seek the supreme good, and they seek to avoid the supreme evil, right? He says, our final good is that for the sake of which other things are to be desired, while it is itself to be desired for its own sake. And the final evil is that for which other things are to be avoided, while it is itself to be avoided on its own account. So that's the supreme good and the supreme evil that he's talking about. He's basically saying that every person, and I think we all understand this. Every person has an idea in their head about what the supreme good is. What's the best? What's the best of human existence? Like, what's the best we can attain? So they all have this idea of what the supreme good is, and we're all living in the way that we believe will lead us to obtain that greatest of all goods. Desiring the things that will bring us closer to it, and avoiding the things that will take us further away from it and closer to the supreme evil, which is to be avoided at all costs. That's his argument. And then he spends time showing how the ways the philosophers suggested for obtaining the supreme good in this life, which is where they located it, they said you can attain the supreme good in this life. And he ends up showing that the ways they suggest are actually all faulty. It doesn't work out that way. And then he contrasts that again with the Christian belief that the supreme good is found after this life. It's found after this life. And he shows how that view transforms life into a trial or a preparation for that supreme good, preparing us for that supreme good. And then from there, he moves on to examine the biblical argument for a resurrection and final judgment, which will determine the eternal ends of each city. The ends, which he said will have no end. The ends which will have no end. The eternal ends, in other words. And finally, in the last two books, he deals with those eternal ends, eternal judgment of the wicked and eternal blessing of the righteous, and questions surrounding those topics. And that's it. That's the city. I just did a summary, and you guys are probably exhausted, right? Yeah, it's a lot. So to try and summarize it as succinctly as I can, Augustine argues that not only was Christianity not responsible for the fall of Rome, but that it alone provides the hope for obtaining blessedness, both in this life and in the one to come. And he made this compelling case by tracing the history of the Romans, the history of humanity in general, and the history of the city of God, showing the faithfulness of the true God and the unreliability of the pagan gods. And he argues powerfully against many of the most compelling pagan philosophers and philosophies of Rome, both popular, sort of like the pop culture philosophies, as well as the more academic ones. And then he contrasts those with the Christian beliefs and shows how they're superior. And in this process, as I said, he makes significant contributions to a whole range of thought, to all of Western thought, really, and contributions that would be relevant for ages to come. In fact, contributions that I think are still relevant for us today. So, once again, as has been the theme of this talk, we are barely going to scratch the surface, but here are 4 lessons I think we would do well to learn from Augustine and the city of God for today. And part of the reason I forgot to put this in my notes, but part of the reason I wanted to trace the back and forth history of Rome and Christianity in the first 3 centuries, sort of resulting in this moment where Rome fell and there was this spike in anti-Christian sentiment, was there's some similarities. I mean, there's been maybe less back and forth in American history, but we've talked about how the public opinion towards Christianity has been shifting for a while and is shifting into a post-Christian. We're moving into a post-Christian context, and that actually shares some similarities with a pagan context or even a pre-Christian context. So that's why I think these things are applicable, and hopefully they'll be helpful for us as we think about furthering the city of God in our day and age. First, while he certainly and forcefully is critical of paganism and its various philosophies, Augustine's criticism was based on a thorough understanding of his culture and its views. A thorough, understatement of the morning, right? A thorough understanding of his culture and its views. His opinion of pagan belief was based on far more than just a few blog posts, so to speak, right? Augustine had read extensively and thought deeply about the views of his opponents. And also, if you read through this, the people, he sort of like, and this was common in sort of ancient argument, was you sort of call up like the hypothetical opponent, right, to kind of argue your case with. The people that he calls up in his book are not, it's not like the unhinged pagan extremist. That's not who he's dealing with. He deals with the cream of the philosophical crop. That's his opponent. That's the opponent that he chooses in his book over and over and over again. Men who would argue most compellingly for Roman beliefs. And I think there's a word in this for us, because so much of the criticism in our culture is based on limited anecdotal evidence, and it targets the extreme or the weakest versions of opposing views. That's a really common, it's really common in our culture. We live in a culture where you don't have to understand a topic to have a strong opinion on it, right? I don't think that's a surprise to any of us. And in such a culture, it's really easy to find a few sensational tweets and a couple of crackpots and to sort of cobble that together into the opposition and then debunk that as absurd. That's really easy to do. Especially in the age of social media. It's much more difficult to argue against an entire established body of work and an entire established body of a philosophy, and to argue against the strongest proponents of opposing viewpoints. That is a much more difficult task. But that's what Augustine did. And that's what I think Christians are called to do as well. In Philippians 4:5, Paul calls Christians to, quote, let your reasonableness be known to everyone. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. And so as Christians, I don't think we come across as reasonable when our critiques, instead of actually debunking the philosophies of our day, our critiques actually reveal we don't really understand the worldviews that we disagree with. I think that does damage to the Christian arguments when we don't understand our opponent deeply. And therefore, I think we should follow Augustine's example and do our homework before we're critical. Second, Augustine understood that the divide between church and the world, or the city of God and the city of man, is not easily defined. It's not easy. In this kind of culture, in the culture he was living in our culture, it is not easy to define. Even as again, as Pastor Brian was talking about, there's with that sort of entrance of culture into the church, the lines get blurred. Throughout the city of God, he makes the point that the two cities are mingled in the world. These two cities are mingled in the world. And recognizing this reality ought to lead us to a nuanced understanding of the makeup of the church and our culture. In fact, and this isn't just Augustine's opinion, he actually at one point references Jesus' parable of the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares is what it's called in Matthew 13, in which Jesus makes it clear that the ungodly and the godly will not be, they're going to be mixed and mingled and hard to tell apart until the very end. Till the very end. It's going to be difficult to tell the city of God from the city of man apart with specificity, at least, until the very end. And what this means, I believe, is that we have to be careful in condemning culture or even vindicating Christianity wholesale all the time, just because both are a mixed bag. In Matthew 25, Jesus makes it clear that at the final judgment, there will be those who are surprised not only to find that they hadn't followed him, that they hadn't served him, but there will also be those who are surprised that they had served him. I mean, what? Jesus, when did we see you when did we give you a drink of water? When did we come visit you in prison? They're going to be surprised to find that they had served him. These two teachings of Jesus, the wheat and the tares, and then this final judgment and the example of Augustine, I think should make it so we're not surprised to find some goodness in our culture. And we're equally not surprised when we come across sin in the church. I think we have to have a nuanced understanding because the wheat and the weeds are mixed in this life. The sheep and the goats are mixed in this life. And therefore, we ought to have a nuanced understanding of the makeup of the church and culture. Third, like Augustine, we ought to present a message that both challenges the lies of our culture concerning the fulfillment of man's deepest needs, while also giving true hope for the fulfillment of man's deepest needs. The city of God begins with this incredible line. I should have put it up, but it begins with the line, "Most glorious is the city of God." Which doesn't mean much to us, but to a Roman reading, that line would have jumped out from the outset. Most glorious is the city of God, because the glory of Rome, I'm trying to remember who spoke this last night, somebody did. The glory of Rome was a big deal. Every citizen was supposed to contribute to the glory of Rome. Building up the glory of Rome was a big deal. And of course, glory in the Roman understanding was sought by conquering and extending the borders and power of Rome as far as possible. So the cultural lie there was that the greater Rome is, the more fulfilled its citizens would be. But Augustine begins his book effectively saying, you want glory? You want to be a part of a real glorious city? The city of God is the most glorious civilization there is. And then he goes on, of course, to argue for that being the case. And he redefines glory, though, rejecting the cultural lie, but also giving hope that the deep human need for meaning can still be met. That deep need for glory, humans need glory, we need it. The lie is that we can find it in Rome or America or anywhere in this life. The truth is it can be found in the city of God. In Matthew 12, Jesus says that it's sort of an enigmatic teaching, but he says that if an unclean spirit leaves a person but is not replaced with something better, then eventually that spirit's just going to come back and it's going to bring its friends. And the last case is going to be worse than the first case of the person. I think part of what Jesus is getting at is that humans, we have deep existential needs. Humans have deep existential needs, and our fallen nature, it drives us to try and meet those needs in sinful ways, like pride or lust or greed or gluttony or gossip and so on. But it's not enough to just point out that those things are wrong, that those things aren't actually meeting our need, that those things are actually killing us. It's not enough to just say that. We also have to provide an alternative. And so, because if we don't provide a better alternative, then those things are just going to come back in force eventually. As Christians, then, we need to be sure to couple our critiques with a message of hope. The supreme good is not available in this life. Our culture needs to hear that. But it also needs to hear the hopeful message that the supreme good is available in eternity, and in fact, redeems this life as well. Finally, Augustine exemplifies viewing life in the context of eternity. He argued that this life is transformed if eternity carries with it either the promise of eternal blessedness or the promise of eternal misery. Eternity transforms this life. If eternal blessedness awaits us, then what earthly calamity is too terrible to endure for the sake of obtaining that prize? Of course, the rhetorical answer is nothing. Conversely, if eternal misery is a possibility, what earthly blessing is worth paying that eternal price? Again, rhetorically, nothing. In Matthew 6, Jesus tells us not to lay up for ourselves earthly treasure that can be lost, but to lay up heavenly treasure that is untouchable. And I think we can surely extend Jesus' principle to more than just our money. Don't invest your life in earthly things that not only might be lost, but in the end certainly will be lost. Don't put your life there. Everything we own will one day be lost. All of our money, all of our possessions will one day go away. All of our earthly achievements, all of our earthly acquaintances and allegiances will one day be forgotten. That day is coming. That day is coming. So invest your life not there, but in heaven. Indeed, the earth itself is going to pass away and the earthly city will be no more. You probably can't see it very well, but I chose my PowerPoint background as a reminder. This is a Roman theater that's in ruins. It's a reminder that Rome fell. It stood for over 1,000 years, but it fell. It went away. And everything else on this earth will too. So let's not build our lives here. C.T. Studd reminds us, only one life 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. In the end, we will stand before Jesus as naked souls. Think about that for just a second. With nothing but our souls. What do you think we will have wanted our lives to have been about then? I'm going to guess the answer to that question has something to do with knowing Christ and making him known. Loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbors as ourselves. Making disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all that Jesus commanded. Those are the things that the citizens of the city of God are concerned about, I would argue. They pursue those ends even as they wander in the wilderness of the earthly city. And that pursuit takes 1,000 different forms, from pastors to pastry chefs, all similarly seeking the eternal kingdom, but in different ways. And I'm way over. I apologize. So I'm just going to end with this quote from Augustine, which there's like a little paragraph where he kind of ends, but this is basically where he ends up. In the words of Augustine, there, the eternal kingdom, we shall rest and see and love and praise. Behold, what will be, in the end, to which there shall be no end. For what other end do we set for ourselves than to reach that kingdom of which there is no end? So in light of eternity, brothers and sisters, may we seek no other end by the grace of God. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your city. We thank you for the privilege of being children of promise, children that you have graciously preserved and brought into your city. And I pray, Father, that as we go from here, I pray that you would use this weekend, all we've learned, all we've heard here. Would you just refine it? Would you refine anything I've said? Would you just refine it, burn up the chaff, purify what's gold, so that we might walk out of here better citizens of your kingdom, living for heaven and not for this earth, but also seeing how the promise of heaven transforms our time on this earth. So may we be good citizens of your eternal city. In Jesus' name, amen.